Hi, I'm John Lutzker. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you, and I'm here to talk about the prevention and intervention for child maltreatment. And we'll certainly have some focus on what applied behavior analysis has to do with that. And we're specifically going to be talking about parenting support for high-risk families. And here's an overview. They always tell you, say something, then tell the audience what you're going to talk about it, and then summarize it. So we're going to talk about violence as a public health issue. We're going to talk about the risk factors for child maltreatment, the sequela, that is the side effects of child maltreatment, the prevalence, how much does it occur, a little bit of history in this country, the role of applied behavior analysis and social learning approaches, a project near and dear to my heart, Project 12 Ways, and a project near and dear to my heart, SafeCare. We're going to talk a bit about other evidence-based practices in child welfare and the issues of dissemination and implementation with these practices, and then my speculations about future directions. So that's what's ahead. So I don't know that many people conceptualize violence, and particularly toward children, as a public health problem, but it has emerged as such. I spent 5 years in Atlanta at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, being the chief of a branch in violence prevention, where we focused on preventing child maltreatment, suicide, youth violence, and partner violence. And if you think about, and I'm going to show you some information now about why it is such a public health problem, from the human costs to the fiscal costs. So there's been greater attention paid to premature mortality as an indicator of health, of the health burden of a disease or condition, and that's so with violence. There's growing emphasis, and behaviorists get this, on data to guide public health practices, and there's a lot of social scientists, let me tell you, at the CDC, and growing acceptance of behavioral and social sciences as integral to public health practice. Most diseases are preventable through changes in behavior. So it's a perfect fit, actually. With respect to public health approach to violence, there's a focus on primary prevention. I will address interventions with families who have been indicated or substantiated for child maltreatment, but we're also going to talk about the importance of prevention. Most federal money today related to intervention, or I should say prevention, is in getting to families before they're involved with the child welfare system. I mean, think of the easy logic of why that makes sense. To provide integrative leadership in public health to make these things happen, and to increase community participation. So, and this is the public health model. I used to have little subtitles for behaviorists, because you'll see that why behavior analysis is such a perfect fit for the public health model. So the public health model first defines the problem and surveils it. That is to say, finds out how much of that problem there is. Well, defining the problem is operational definitions, isn't it? Identify causes, functional assessment, other ways to look at behavior, and then develop and evaluate evaluations, and then finally, and most importantly, to implement and disseminate a model that's effective. And that's the model. So this is a non-exhaustive but very empirically based, evidence-based list of some of the risk factors for child maltreatment. One is if a child has a teen parent. Another one is a single parent. Low income. In fact, poverty is the single most frequent factor suggesting child or predicting child maltreatment. Now, you say, well, I've heard of middle-class people, even wealthy people who have been involved in forms of family violence. Of course you have, but it is unequivocally more prevalent because of poverty. If a parent has one or more of the following, the risk factors go up: mental illness, intellectual disability, substance abuse, partner violence in the home, that is, a child is witnessing violence. There are pretty good data to support that many families are involved in intergenerational violence. Think about it. You know about modeling. And if you don't have a different or better model, you'll hear you've heard friends, let alone parents involved in risk factors say my dad beat me, I'm okay, so I beat my kid. I remember a football star who was arrested for caning his child, and he said, that's just practice. And I won't say the state, but in the state that I grew up in. And the age of a child is related to risk factors. The younger the child, the higher the risk. That is, there's an inverse relationship between age and maltreatment risk. The most dangerous day of a child's life as far as dying from maltreatment is day one. If a child can get through the first 24 hours, then the risk, to some degree, starts to go down. And I think if you think about all that, you'll think about, that all makes sense, the inverse relationship between age and risk. This graphic comes from more than a generation of data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in collaboration initially with Kaiser Permanente Health in San Diego. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, ACEs. And ACEs are those variables that I just talked about, having a parent with mental illness or disability or partner violence in the home. The more of those someone experiences and the higher frequency with which someone experiences those, the higher risk they have the rest of their lives for all these variables, which is striking. So you wouldn't be surprised, I'm going to skip down to the bottom part for a minute, but that there are mental and social problems that are sequela of having problems in the home. And those are PTSD, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, neurobiological problems, low academic achievement, unwanted pregnancies, obesity, and re-victimization. So the more of those ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences a child experiences, the higher likelihood throughout the rest of their life that they will experience one or more of those health problems goes up compared to children who don't experience adverse childhood experiences. Then there's the health risk behaviors, sexual promiscuity, sexual perpetration. Many children who experience ACEs perpetrate sexual violence later in life. Alcohol abuse, illicit injected drug use, smoking, and behavior problems. And here's the amazing one, both interpersonally or for individuals' lives, but also for cost, and that is, and again, these data are incontrovertible, higher risk of heart disease, higher risk of diabetes, stroke, cancer, suicide, skeletal fractures, chronic bronchitis and emphysema, STDs, and hepatitis. So, and you could get a whole mix of these if you experience a whole lot of ACEs, and this is lifelong. Children who are victims of child maltreatment are going to cost the taxpayer at least $250,000 in that one child's lifetime because of the sequela of these problems. It's a huge public health problem. Maybe you hadn't thought of it being one before, but now hopefully you do. What about brains? I'm no neuroscientist, but this is pretty easy to see. So just look at the two scans of the brain there. Look at the top one, which has a lot of color, and meaning there's a lot of activity going in that brain. That's the brain of a child who hasn't experienced chronic stress of the kind we're talking about. That's what we hope our children's brains look like, and you all look like really bright people, and I bet there's all kinds of cool stuff. Now, at my age, it looks more like the bottom one. It's just, you know, I forget who I am later in the day and that kind of thing. But so that bottom one is the sad reality of a brain of a child that's been experiencing stress, chronic stress, toxic environments, as one scientist called it. So severe or chronic childhood stress due to maltreatment can lead to persistent effects on brain chemistry and lifelong problems in health, behavior, and learning. So this is a very serious public health problem. The national data on substantiated reports of child maltreatment take 2 years to report. So I'm talking to you in 2018, and these are the most recent data nationally. There's a couple pieces of good news by and large there. This comes out of the University of New Hampshire every year, the work largely of the world's most prominent epidemiologist in violence, David Finkelhor, puts these data out every year. This breaks it down between neglect, one form, and I'm going to define for you in a few minutes the kinds of neglect, but one form of abuse is neglect. Physical abuse is the one that is that grabs most or much of the attention. It's actually not the most prevalent. And then sexual abuse. So there's two of these graphs here, and this is a 26-year trend. Shows improvements, which we cannot be anything but pleased with. But let's remember what we're talking about: physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse. One case is one case too many. But in these past many years, there's been a 53% decline in physical abuse in this country, and that's because of the work of some of my colleagues in this room, maybe some of my work, and a lot of other important variables, including public awareness, new laws, better reporting, media efforts, and so forth. That is good news, and there was a little blip in 2016. So we're hoping this blip is what you call an artifact, and that it goes back down in the next report. There are always concerns that problems with funding, if funding for social services programs should go down or down some more, maybe that would trend up a little bit. But if you look at the data there overall, there's certainly positive trends. Sexual abuse has gone down 65%. There's much speculation. There's been so much advocacy, anything from Me Too to on the legal end, how far a known perpetrator has to be from living in a school, and just way better monitoring, public awareness, changes in social norms, and so forth. So this is good news. There's less good news about neglect, and that's of concern. However, the two projects in particular I'm going to talk to you about today have very hopeful information about neglect, because they are among the next to few others that actually have a focus on giving parents skills that who have deficits that probably relate to why there's neglect going on in the home, and some of the results are pretty striking. But part of the problem with neglect only going down 12% in all these years is that in the United States, 80% of all substantiated cases of child maltreatment are for neglect. And the sequelae of neglect are as serious as physical abuse. For example, when it comes to children becoming aggressive, it turns out that children who have experienced neglect become even more aggressive than children who have been physically abused. So we have more work to do with neglect. In 2016, all those data you saw with respect to abuse and neglect turn out to be 645,000 substantiated cases in the U.S. Now, focus on substantiated because what we know from something called the Periodic National Incident Study, those data come from states' reports. Every state reports to the federal government. This year we substantiated this many cases. There's something called the National Incident Study which surveys what are called sentinels. So police officers, teachers, clergy, and they say, they ask, how many people have talked to you, or how did you investigate or make a report? And that's usually about 4 times more than the actual substantiated cases. So even though there was 645,000 substantiated cases in 2016, there was probably actually 2.5 million incidences of child maltreatment, something else about which to be concerned. And I've mentioned that child maltreatment is a serious public health burden, humanly and in the burden of costs, as they say in public health. So here's a little bit of history. There is a date error on here that I want you to memorize. But so in the early 20th century, that is around the early 1900s, the first case of child maltreatment was adjudicated through a New York State Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, a chapter of that. Why? Because the only laws protecting children at that point in our history were new laws that were labor laws that said you can't work a child 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. We had laws protecting dogs and cats, but not children. So some smart prosecutor in New York State said, well, this child was clearly abused by a parent. We're all animals, and it was successfully adjudicated through the SPCA, which is pretty sad but creative. This next seminal event that I thought I'd corrected is 1962, not 82. So when you all are forced to take a quiz by me, when I call you up someday and I say, when was the famous Kemp et al. Study published? Don't say 82, say 62. And I remember I was about a 14-year-old child, and I was watching the national news with my parents, which I did every night, sitting on the couch, and a news bite came out saying a new report coming out from the American Medical Association says that there's this problem of it was called battered child syndrome in this country, and this came about from the pioneering pediatrician Henry Kemp and his colleagues noticing that in emergency rooms or in pediatrics offices there was not a correspondence between the kind of injury a child was presenting and the parent's explanation. So the easiest one to describe is what are called spiral fractures. A fracture that has to do with twisting doesn't happen from a swing. A child falling off a swing or bumping into a coffee table just can't happen. It costs from somebody seriously twisting. And then there were burns for which the explanations were not credible and so forth. This was truly a wildly important event in the history of us finally making some progress in the United States in this area. It took still 12 years for Congress to enact the Federal Child Abuse and Protection Act, which is called CAPTA, which is recertified every, I think it's 5 years or maybe 7. But CAPTA has been in continuous effect for since 1974, and it requires mandated state reporting, requires funding for studying the problem and for interventions. And I think it was by the late 70s, every state had developed child reporting. Child Abuse Reporting Act. As far as the first behavioral evidence-based interventions, there was really nothing but individual psychotherapy until the late 70s, early 80s. Denicola and Sandler at University of South Florida, and Sandler with another student also had published 2 studies using basically behavior therapy, or what later came to be called cognitive behavior therapy, with a parent, because one of we started understanding in the 70s what those risk factors were, one of which was stress. So they used some stress reduction techniques and reported improvements in parent-child interactions, and that it was literally 2-3 families were mothers were talking about, and there were no future reports of child maltreatment. So that was the sort of ground floor of maybe we can do something other than just talk therapy with families. And then I'm going to talk to you about Project 12 Ways, which began on July 1st, 1979, but the first published article was in 1982 in the journal Education and Treatment of Children, and it was called An Eco-Behavioral Approach to the Treatment and Prevention of An Eco-Behavioral Approach to the Treatment of Children. That's probably my bad typing. I think it was a little longer title than that, but that doesn't matter. And then David Wolf, I couldn't find the reference for his original manual on parent training for high-risk families. This was a book he put out in '87, but it was in the earlier '80s. He came out with a thin but incredibly wonderful book of a program he'd developed in Ontario, Canada, using pretty standard behavior modification principles at the time in parent training with high-risk families. And David was one of the real pioneers. And then I'm going to talk a little bit in a second about specifically some ABA and social learning backgrounds or approaches to the area, but I want to talk to you in general about evidence-based practices and some of the commonalities. So all this here is most but not all. So most evidence-based practices, and there are evidence-based practices that I'll show you in a second that are not what you would recognize as behavioral, but there is strong evidence or modest evidence in cases that those work. Most deal with birth to 5. So when the child's born, if you get a hold of the family right away and you take kids up to 5. Some go from birth to 18. Some go from prenatal to, and I put ... because some go from prenatal to 2. Some go from prenatal to 4 or 5. Some go from prenatal to 20. The largest and probably most evidence-based program in the world is Nurse-Family Partnership, and they only take prenatal parents. So that's really a prevention program. This is a first-time mother who hasn't had a child. I guess that's self-defining, isn't it? And she is seen prenatally. And then there's a little bit of follow-up after the child's born. Virtually all of them take a developmental approach. So the interventions, any protocols are tailored appropriately to the age and developmental level of the child. Some focus on the parent, it's really parent training. Some focus on the child, some focus on both. Most have a prevention component. In fact, more have a prevention component than they have a service for adjudicated families. Some deal exclusively with abuse, some exclusively with neglect, most with both. Some have a component for substance abuse for the family. Some deal with partner violence, although I am sad to say there's no truly evidence-based programs in partner violence. So mostly it's referring to whatever kind of services may be available in a community to do with partner violence. Partner violence and child maltreatment are highly comorbid in high-risk homes. And then some deal with special needs programs, and I'll address some of that today. Common things among evidence-based practices are that most of them are structured, most of them are manualized, there are role-playing components, there is high fidelity, that is, there are data that show that the trainers or home visitors are doing what are performing in the manner they were trained, and that the parents are carrying out the procedures in the manner that they were trained. I mentioned developmental. All are positive. There's not a single evidence-based practice that recommends caning or even spanking, and they all focus on the positive, which is eminently logical. The majority of evidence-based programs in high risk and in child welfare families are delivered in-home. I'm just going to cover a few of these. I stole this slide from a wonderful colleague in South Carolina by the name of Ben Saunders. His work and our colleagues in South Carolina mostly deal with the cognitive end in mostly older children, and not specifically child maltreatment. But the first behavioral one I want to focus on is the second one there on the list, parent-child interaction therapy, PCIT. It looks an awful lot like early behavior modification techniques, and it looks an awful lot like the work of Forehand and McMahon of the 1980s. And I have a graphic. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the PCIT folks and the Forehand and McMahon took behavioral parent training from what was really mostly just differential reinforcement of other behavior and timeout, and occasionally a token program, a smiley face chart kind of program, and they took it to start focusing more on antecedents. That is to say, engagement of children, teaching parents to spend time with their children, and then the parent learns about reinforcement. In the case of PCIT, timeout. Now, my programs don't utilize timeout, but in any case, that PCIT and the Forehand and McMahon model really shifted behavior modification from sort of being at its very most basic level to a next step. SafeCare is something I'll talk about with passion and to some degree ad nauseum today. The Incredible Years is more for somewhat older children. It's a video-based program, and it has a good school component, but it has dabbled in child maltreatment. It's the brainchild of Carolyn Webster Stratton. Very strong social learning approach, a lot of video modeling, absolutely included in that ABA / social learning category. Functional family therapy comes out of Oregon, really the Patterson model. Good evidence base for that program, focuses with somewhat older children and also on youth problems. And then Triple P, I think I talk about in more depth in a while too, but Matt Sanders, its founder in Queensland, Australia, and Triple P is all over the world. Has his roots right where mine are. I went to graduate school at the University of Kansas, and my mentors were the very pioneers of the field of behavior analysis. Bear, Wolf, Risley, Hopkins, Sherman, and so forth. Todd Risley was a particular idol of mine, and later in life we became close friends and colleagues, and it was just a fantastic thing for me. Todd had a sabbatical, or he was on a tour or something. Matt at the time was a graduate student at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and Todd came blowing through New Zealand for a while, and Matt Sanders said, I get this. And Matt developed Triple P, which has different kinds of levels of intensity for parents, and it's a birth to 20 program, but there's been a lot of work done on Triple P in child maltreatment and family. In fact, when I was at CDC, I funded the largest study in child maltreatment we funded for a huge trial at a universal level in South Carolina, with some not mind-blowing results, but with some good results, showing that counties that had Triple P had fewer emergency room visits than counties that did not have triple P, and had lowered rates of child maltreatment than counties that didn't have triple P at a time when child maltreatment was increasing. So actually triple P counties had an increase, but it was less of an increase than the counties that didn't get triple P. But there's been all kinds. Triple P probably has the most randomized trials of any evidence-based behavioral program. So I bet I could anger a whole bunch of people with this list, because I may have left somebody out. But I wanted to acknowledge solid ABA roots and people who went on to affect this field. And I'll tell you some about Project 12 Ways and Project SafeCare. And my roots are solidly ABA. Waller and Dumas did some wonderful work at the University of Tennessee identifying characteristics such as social isolation of mothers involved in child welfare. And Jean Dumas went on to develop Head Start-based interventions that are very behavioral with some good results. Something else I funded when I was at CDC, and we were looking at attrition and retention and what variables would keep Head Start mothers in programs and how you get their attention in the first place. PCIT I mentioned, triple P I mentioned. In Florida, Stoudemire and colleagues developed a program, Tools of Choice, for the child welfare system, and very nice behavior program, and grew more. Like I think that Project 12 Ways and SafeCare sort of grew behavior analysis from what I described as originally behavior modification, and then the work of PCIT and Forehand and McMahon expanded a little bit, and to look at making the whole thing bigger. So theirs is a 30-hour parent training course across several weeks. It involves instruction, role play, homework, in-home coaching, and they found in the Florida system a decrease in out-of-home placements and improvements in target parenting behaviors. I don't think they looked at reports of child maltreatment. Vollmer and his colleagues at the University of Florida work in an area that desperately needs more work, and that's foster care. And other caregivers, but primarily foster care. And with foster care parents, parenting skills improved very much with a very similar program to the other Florida program. Carr and his colleagues in Alabama had looked at 171 intervention families and 171 control families. It was not a randomized control study, and it was mostly pre-post data. But they had a 15-hour course that produced much better family reunification than the control families, and many more families remained in the home. And then Rick Smith and his colleagues at the University of North Texas extended the Florida programs in ways. They used a lot of role playing in what they call stay close. In other words, supervise your kids, be close enough to see what they're doing and be able to give them feedback and redirect them, so forth. Lots of reinforcement. They teach parents to what they call ignore junk behavior, that those minor things that bother us that you just put up with, and then you reinforce that, which is good. And then the pretty common reinforce and redirect. Wholly positive programs with some nice outcomes. So now I have to really whip through the history of some projects that I was involved with. So Project 12 Ways was funded on July 1st, 1979. It's the second oldest evidence-based practice, as far as we know, in the world in child maltreatment prevention. The older one being David Old's, that Nurse-Family Partnership, which I believe started in '77. It's called 12 Ways because at the last minute somebody called me up and said, we need a shorter computer title for this. It was called an eco-behavioral approach to the treatment and prevention of child abuse and neglect. And I'd been trying to come up with some clever acronym, couldn't come up with one. I had the abstract sitting on my desk, and we had outlined 12 services that were based on intervention for known risk factors. And I said, Project 12 Ways. I can't tell you the number of people who have come up to me over the years and said, oh, I'm familiar with your 12 Steps program. No, wrong program. I have to go over this quickly, but you can see that this is skill-based, in-home. I put a lot of work based on the literature on risk factors and my experience working in developmental and intellectual disabilities and parent training, trying to come up with this model. I didn't know very much about the child welfare system. In fact, the region in Southern Illinois of Department of Children and Family Services, the Southern Illinois newspaper, not the university, but the newspaper ran an article about me, the local paper, because it's sort of boring there, and I guess this guy's coming from California, is here to run a graduate program, and he knows something about parent training. They called me and basically said, okay, smart guy, there's federal money coming in to do something about child abuse and neglect. What would you do about it? And I blah, blah, blah at them, and they said, okay, let's do it. I thought we'd do a little pilot project, 10 families, try it out. They said, okay, we'll help you write it, $500,000, 100 families a year. Initially, I think it was 27 counties. And the part of what I didn't get is I thought we'd have a specialist in every one of these skill training areas. And they said, you're going to be lucky to bring one person in the home, not 12 different people in the home over time. So we taught our staff to be generalists, to do, by no means did every family get every skill, and I'm sure that's still so today, but you give the family what the family needs most. But that's how it was founded. 3 particularly efficacy studies found that with quasi-experimental designs that in every case there was lower risk to children who had received Project 12 Ways services, that is, future incidences of abuse, lower risk than families who had had services as usual. One study even found that because this wasn't randomized, the first year the caseworkers referred the most difficult families to us because they wanted to get rid of us. They didn't think a university-based service was going to last, and we were weird, and we were doing all these weird things. And then they continued to give us the most difficult cases because they came to actually really like the services. And the measure of difficult families was that families who were referred to Project 12 Ways had many more pre-referral reports than services as usual families. So that was very nice data to have. And then there were many single case studies, and you especially need single case research studies to validate your protocols and make sure you know what you're doing and tweak them if you have to. So importantly, and I hope my colleague Brandon Green and whoever's running SafeCare now doesn't see this presentation, because I don't know how accurate these data are. I did sort of a predictive model, but I do know it's still ongoing, and it has brought in millions of dollars, trained hundreds of professionals, and saved thousands of families. And I'll tell you more about SafeCare in a different graphic here. So I left Southern Illinois. I went to California, and I was funded by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation to create the national. No, I'm sorry, that happened in Georgia. I got ahead of myself. I was funded by the California Wellness Foundation. They had read all about 12 Ways and said, can you do this in California in a much more urban environment, much more ethnically and racially diverse environment, and can you focus on health and make it disseminable? Can you train people who look a lot like caseworkers in terms of their skills, and make it more succinct. So we created something, we took the 3 most commonly used modules of 12 Ways: child safety, child health, and parent-child and parent-infant interactions. And at that time, there was each module had 6 sessions, 18 sessions in all. We used a structured teaching model, role play, and so forth. And we did it, and I'll show you some outcome data in a bit. But so the way we do it now is session 1 is assessment. Sessions 2, 3, 4, and 5 are training in each of the 3 modules. And session 6 is reassessment to see if there's any booster needed and to make sure parents are meeting the criteria. We also teach problem solving and communication training, or at least tweak it, in our home visitors. Home safety teaches parents to understand the importance of a safe home, know the types of hazards in the home, remove the types of hazards, and understand the importance of, as talked about with another project, keeping your eye on your children, that is supervision. And it's an arduous program in terms of, or I shouldn't say arduous, but it's strict. So we still measure a child from the armpit to the tip of the biggest finger to see what's accessible for the child, to keep it that we can disseminate and teach so many others to do it. We choose 3 rooms. The parents choose the rooms. We count the hazards. Parents tell us where we can't look. And then we gradually teach them to remove the hazards and make things inaccessible to the kids, and we reassess. Those are the categories within which we count safety hazards. I should have put in I often have a picture of a neglect home. If you've never been in one, you can't even imagine. Even maybe a gun under the sink, maybe prescription and illicit medication or illicit drugs on a coffee table accessible to a toddler, fireplaces without screens. But these are the categories: suffocating items, drowning items, fire and electrical hazards, for example, an electric outlet with no plate cover, choking hazards, crushing hazards, falls, poisons, firearms, sharp objects, and mold and other bacteria and so forth in the home. So that's pretty much the safety module. I'll show you some data in a minute. Parent-child interaction is for children who are ambulatory to age 5. We teach them to positively interact with their children, enhance parent-child relationships, use incidental teaching. That's always teaching, always saying, what color is this ball? Red, good. Teaching them anything. What color is the fire truck? Yellow. Do you know why? Because you can see yellow best. To plan and organize daily and play activities with the child and with the child playing alone, and that's the engagement part. Children who are engaged are less likely to demonstrate challenging behaviors than children who are not. And we have the pieces of this are wonderful. You warn the child that there's going to be something new happening. You give the child feedback. You tell the child what the consequences are going to be of the activity. We do that with each other. Show the same courtesy to your children. And you know what? You get in trouble when you're not engaged. And it's so for all of us. So engaging children is sort of the primary focus of what we do with SafeCare in the way of preventing challenging behaviors. And this just goes over, well, there's 2 curricula. The other one is parent-infant interaction, and that's also about engagement and stimulation. We train parents in LOTS, which is an acronym for looking, talking, touching, and smiling. We know how critically important that is, and the talk, and when you think you've talked enough, keep talking to your baby, whether your baby understands the words or not. that was Todd Risley's mission later in life, was get parents to talk to their kids. Bloomberg has funded a wonderful project in Providence, Rhode Island called the Providence, I think it's called the Providence Project. It teaches Latina mothers that very simple issue of talk, and talk some more. These are examples of it, what we call bonding. It's not a well-defined thing, bonding, but it's holding, imitating, rocking. Then health is the most arduous of the modules, and the parents like it the best. The health is not evaluative, in to say that if you're doing the home safety module, there's an implication that your home is not safe. If you're teaching parenting skills, no matter how with good skills you present it, it's suggesting you might want to do something different. Everybody wants their kids to be safe. We have wonderful materials that have been validated by docs and nurses 3 times in the history of the project. They have health manuals, they practice scenarios, they take data, they bring fever data to pediatricians who go, whoa, I've never had a parent, with time of day and what the temperature was and so forth. And the bottom line of what we want to teach in the health model is for them to be able to accurately make a decision to self-treat, to recognize an illness, self-treat it, or to call for a medical appointment, or at least get medical advice on the phone, or take the child to an emergency department. Some broad outcomes of SafeCare in a state, the largest study in the history of the field in Oklahoma, 2,200 families, randomized trial. Half of the state received Project 12 Ways, SafeCare, half of the state received enhanced services as usual, and dramatically reduced recidivism, that is repeated child maltreatment, over 7 years than services as usual. And further, on paper and pencil measures, there was less child abuse potential, and parents showed lower stress, lower depression who received 12 Ways. SafeCare. This study, when I read it, by the Washington State Institute of Public Policy, I got out a magnifying glass to make sure I was seeing the data correctly, because no other evidence-based practice returned anywhere near $14.85 in benefits for every dollar spent. And recently they reanalyzed their data, and it's looking like it's $20 for every dollar spent. In the United Kingdom, it's £3 for every pound spent. There's been many adaptations, particularly with Native Americans and Latinos, fathers, children with behavior problems, older children. We are augmented with motivational interviewing in terms of getting parents' willingness to engage in the first place. I got some funding from the Annie Casey Foundation to braid 2 evidence-based practices. I could spend another hour telling you about that, but for me, that's the kind of thing we need to be doing. No one project is a panacea. No one program is a fit. One person might be allergic to penicillin. One person might be able to take penicillin, but is allergic to a different antibiotic. It's the same for home-based parent support programs. And so we need to be finding out how to combine programs, how to create a program that's the right one for a given family. The dissemination and the training are pyramidal, in that we train home visitors, we train coaches within agencies to coach the home visitors, and we train designated people in the agencies to become trainers so that they're not reliant on our home office the rest of their lives. Those of you familiar with single case study, I just wanted to tell you we published a lot of studies over time. This one's about the planned activities training piece of the parent-child interaction. This one has a rare dad in it. The second dad, what is this? This is a multiple baseline across parents. And the novel piece also was we used video training. And you see nice improvements in the parenting outcomes after training. These data this was in the Journal of Family Violence, and these data, the really cool thing was this helped with the intervention. So this is, and if you look at these hazards in this home, and this is very common, in the family, in the living room, in baseline, there was what, about on average in the 2 sessions, 55 accessible hazards just in the living room. And in the kitchen, more like 85 accessible hazards. And it's not uncommon with the safety module that you see in follow-up 0 or next to or near 0 hazards in the home. What we did with the smartphone was that after initial training and being put through 1 session, mom was given a smartphone, videoed the rooms, texted them to Julie Jobali. This was my first MPH master's student thesis at Georgia State University, and Julie gave feedback via text. And look at those results. This is cost savings. Even if, now you're not going to give them this. This is a Apple X. I don't even want to tell you what it costs. They had to pick me off the floor when they told me how much it costs. But this is where technology is going to improve everything we do. This is these are data on these are health data, and this is a multiple baseline design across. Oh, we had a dad in this one too, showing the parents demonstrating the skills that we're looking for in that parent-infant interaction. This is the statewide trial in Oklahoma. I already sort of told you about it, but dramatic results of differences. This is something called a survival chart, very common in public health. Survival means you didn't run into the problem again. SafeCare, this shows dissemination across the United States. The orange is where SafeCare is statewide. The what I think is sort of the prettier blue colors is where there's a pretty strong footprint of SafeCare, and the other color is where there's been previous involvement but not something going on now. That's pretty widespread dissemination nonetheless. And we're in the country of Belarus, pretty widely spread across the United Kingdom with some good evaluation results. A very small research study in Spain. We're growing in Ontario, Canada. Small project in Israel. One of my favorite things with respect to Israel and the United Kingdom is we take soft data, we take qualitative data. How do you like your provider? How do the providers feel about the outcomes in the project? I have a graphic that I use in some presentations that has comments from Israeli parents and Israeli providers and British providers and parents, and they're virtually the same. I love my home visitor. I can't believe the change it made in my child, especially like the health module and things like that. So something very common language about it, whether the language is Hebrew, Spanish, whatever they speak in Australia. Actually, we're growing wildly in Australia. It's really on fire there. I think I talked about adaptations. I'm not going to tell you much more about our PATCH stands for Parents as Teachers, SafeCare at Home. So there's a nice program called Parents as Teachers. It's not highly structured. We've added the health and safety to it. The state of Colorado particularly loves PATCH, and they're getting more and more grants to look at it there. Colorado is one of the places where SafeCare is statewide. Colorado knows how to implement evidence-based programs. We have some fantastic outcome data on the statewide application. Why focus on implementation? I like to say that children and families can't benefit from interventions they don't receive. I think there's many rating systems for evidence-based practices now, some federal, some private. My favorite one is the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare. It's peer-reviewed, but they review programs. I think every program's implementation should be rated, because you hear horror stories about some implementations, but that's just me. Lofty goals for evidence-based practices: widespread dissemination, high penetration of use, adequate fidelity and sustained use. What's missing? I don't have time to give my whole spiel on that, but even more focus on enrichment, designing interventions based on known protective factors. We tend to use almost an emergency room model rather than well, we know that this works and this works. This seems to keep families cooking. There are more families in poverty who are doing just fine than there are who are not. We don't know as much about their practices as we do about sort of middle class just fine practices. When I say pride with praise, I don't mean, I get a little, one of my pet peeves. Oh, Jimmy, I'm so proud of you for holding your spoon just right. Oh, come on. I mean when the parent is so expressing, like when Jimmy hears mom say, I am so proud of how Jimmy treats other children. That's what I mean with praise with pride, and I don't think we focus on that kind of praise. And then what I mentioned about best fits. We need to tailor programs for families, not just give them our PAT program. Things that we know parents are interested in that behaviorists don't, except a little bit triple P, seem to deal with emotions and fears, sex education, dating, death, religion. We forget about it, and yet in people's everyday lives, those are very prominent things. Lutzker's recipe for evidence-based practices, you got to have buy-in by the parents and the agency. The agency needs to have capacity to deliver it. You need fidelity monitoring. Someday your preschool child will start a human development curriculum of how to be a better parent. There always needs to be policy change. We talked about parameter changing. We need to integrate evidence-based practices into systems, best fits for families, self-sustaining funding streams, skill-based, and I'm at a place I'm speaking at a place that really gets technology. Technology is going to make it cheaper and better. I wish I had time to tell you about some incredibly cool health. I'm working with some colleagues at the Telehealth Center at the University of Southern California, and there's some wonderful things going on there. I've sort of said this: menus, protective factors, collaboration, and lowering costs through technology. I'm glad someone in this organization asked me to talk about organizations and journals. There's a chapter of Prevent Child Abuse and Neglect in every state. The center at which I'm retiring this week has Georgia's Prevent Child Abuse Georgia chapter at Georgia State University. They have very important advocacy, training for reporting. Get involved in your PCA in your state. There is a national Prevent Child Abuse America, and these are chapters in every state. There's the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, APSAC, and there's the International Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, IPSCAN. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in this field, get involved with them. Journals that you see probably the most work related in the field is Child Abuse and Neglect, the International Journal, Child Maltreatment, the editor of which is at Georgia State University, the current editor. That's probably got the best research in the field. Research on Social Work Practice, Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics, American Journal of Public Health, Child and Family Studies, Journal of Family Violence, Child and Family Behavior Therapy. Somebody asked me, what about behavioral journals? There's been a smattering. I've published in JABA, I've published in Education and Treatment of Children, but the readership isn't the readership you really want. You know how many hundreds of thousands of people read JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association? So in fact, if you're interested in anything I've said today and want to know more about it, there's my email. It will continue to be. Oh, I put my new title. That's not my title until Thursday of this week. And come see me in Paradise, where I've been living for the last 10 months and will the rest of my life. So that's it. I hope you've gotten something out of that, and I'm very serious about, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email and ask for, I can give you a study. I can bore you for the rest of your life with articles. So that's it.